Welcome to Black Fire Chronicles, where history's untold stories and deep conflicts come to life. If you're into powerful narratives, historical struggles, and the intense clashes between black and white communities, make sure to hit like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Black Fire Chronicles, where the fire never dies. The Ashes of Greenwood, inspired by the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, The Ashes of Greenwood is a fictional narrative that follows the lives of three interconnected characters: Lila Jackson, a young black entrepreneur; Thomas Reed, a disillusioned white war veteran; and Clara Mayfield, a progressive journalist, whose paths collide in the aftermath of a devastating racial massacre in a fictionalized American city called Dunston in 1923. The story explores themes of systemic racism, economic disparity, the fragility of community, and the struggle for justice in a deeply divided society. Through their eyes, we witness the destruction of a thriving black neighborhood, the complicity and guilt of a white populace, and the slow, painful fight to rebuild amid lingering hatred and governmental neglect. Spanning decades, the narrative weaves historical echoes with fictional stakes, culminating in a modern-day reflection on how the scars of the past continue to shape America's social landscape. Opening chapter: The Spark Before the Flame. Approximate 1,000 words. Dunston, Oklahoma, May 1923. The air smelled of honeysuckle and coal smoke, a strange marriage of sweetness and grit that clung to the streets of Dunston's Negro district, known to its residents as Little Eden. Lila Jackson stood on the warped porch of her dress shop, her hands smoothing the apron tied around her slender waist. At 24, she was a rarity, a woman who owned her own business in a town where most folks, black or white, scraped by on borrowed dreams. The shop, with its hand-painted sign reading Lila's Finery, was her defiance against a world that told her she'd never amount to more than a maid in some white woman's kitchen. Inside, the shelves brimmed with bolts of fabric, cotton, silk, even a precious yard of velvet she'd bartered for with a traveling peddler. Her sewing machine hummed late into the night, stitching dresses for the wives of black doctors, teachers, and preachers who turned Little Eden into a pocket of prosperity amid Oklahoma's red dirt plains. They called it the Black Wall Street of the West, a moniker that swelled Lila's chest with pride even as it drew envious glares from across the railroad tracks. That morning, the sun hung low, casting long shadows over the cobblestone street. Children darted past, their laughter a melody against the clatter of horse-drawn carts. Lila watched them, her dark eyes narrowing as a figure approached from the east: Thomas Reed, a lanky white man with a limp and a face hardened by too many years of seeing things he couldn't unsee. He'd come back from the Great War a ghost of himself, or so the whispers said, and now he ran odd jobs for the folks in Little Eden, fixing roofs and hauling coal. He tipped his cap to her, his blue eyes catching the light. "Mornin', Miss Lila," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Got that thread you asked for from the mercantile?" She nodded, stepping forward to take the small paper package from his calloused hands. "Much obliged, Thomas. How's the leg today?" "Same as yesterday. Hurts like the devil, but it don't stop me none." He shifted his weight, glancing down the street where a crowd was gathering near the barber shop. "Somethin's brewin'. You hear about that boy they locked up last night?" Lila's stomach tightened. She'd heard the rumors: Elijah Brooks, a shoeshine boy, accused of brushing up against a white girl in an elevator downtown. It was the kind of story that spread like wildfire, twisting truth into something ugly. "Yeah," she said softly. "They sayin' he touched her. Ain't nobody a skin if it's true." Thomas shook his head, his jaw clenching. "Folks over the tracks are riled up. Talkin' about teachin' a lesson. I don't like it." Before Lila could reply, a motorcar roared past, kicking up dust. Clara Mayfield leaned out the window, her auburn hair pinned beneath a cloche hat, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She was a reporter for the Dunston Herald, a rarity herself, a woman in a man's trade, and one who didn't shy from poking at the town's festering wounds. She waved at Lila, her sharp green eyes glinting with purpose. "Lila. Thomas. You seen the crowd by the courthouse? Clara called. Braking the car with a screech. They're saying a mob's forming. I'm headed there now. Lila's heart sank. She'd seen this before, not here, but in the stories her grandmother told of Georgia, of men in hoods and flames that swallowed whole towns. Clara, you be careful, she warned. They don't take kindly to folks stirrin' the pot. Clara grinned, a fierce edge to it. That's why I do it. I'll get the truth out, one way or another. As the car sped off, Thomas muttered, she's gonna get herself killed one day. Lila didn't answer. She was staring at the horizon, where the white side of Dunstan loomed like a storm cloud. Little Eden had thrived in spite of them, doctors' offices. A theater, even a hotel with electric lights, but that thriving came with a cost. Envy was a slow poison, and fear was its spark. By noon, the air had shifted. The laughter of children faded, replaced by the low murmur of anxious voices. Men in overalls gathered outside the barber shop, their hands restless, eyes darting toward the courthouse miles away. Lila locked her shop and joined them, her pulse quickening. Elijah Brooks was one of theirs, a boy who'd polished her shoes just last week, his grin wide as the sky. If the white folks wanted him, they'd have to go through Little Eden first. Thomas lingered nearby, his limp more pronounced as he paced. You shouldn't go down there. Miss Lila, he said. It's gonna turn bad. I ain't sittin' by while they string up one of ours, she snapped, her voice steel. You gonna help, or you gonna stand there? He hesitated, then nodded. I'll go. But I ain't promisin' it'll end well. They didn't know then how right he'd be. By nightfall, the spark would catch, and Little Eden would burn, not just with fire, but with the weight of a nation's unhealed wounds. Chapter 2, The Gathering Storm, Dunstan, Oklahoma, May 1923, the sun dipped low, painting the sky a bruised purple as Lila Jackson marched alongside a growing knot of men and women from Little Eden. Their footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, a determined rhythm that drowned out the evening crickets. Most carried what they could, shotguns cradled in calloused hands, kitchen knives tucked into belts, a few with nothing but fists and fury. Elijah Brooks wasn't just a boy to them, he was a symbol, a line in the sand they'd sworn never to let the white folks cross. Lila's dress swished against her legs, the hem already dusted red from the road. She'd swapped her apron for a shawl. Her sewing shears slipped into her pocket, a weapon if it came to that. Beside her, Thomas Reed limped along, his face tight with something between resolve and dread. He'd grabbed a rifle from his shack on the edge of town, though he hadn't fired it since France. The weight of it seemed to pull him down, his shoulders hunched as if carrying more than just steel. You don't have to do this, Thomas, Lila said, her voice low so the others wouldn't hear. This ain't your fight. He glanced at her, his blue eyes shadowed. Ain't it? I been fixin' roofs here, eatin' your folks' cornbread. If I walk away now, I'm no better than them across the tracks. She didn't argue. There was a hardness in him she hadn't seen before. A flicker of the man he'd been before the war broke him. Maybe he needed this as much as they did, a chance to stand for something when the world had given him so little to hold on to. Ahead, the courthouse loomed, a squat brick building with white columns that gleamed like teeth in the dusk. A crowd had already gathered, white men in overalls and Sunday shirts, their voices a low growl that carried on the wind. Lila spotted pickaxes, baseball bats, even a few rifles glinting under the gas lamps. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just talk anymore. Stay close, she murmured to Thomas, her hand brushing the shears in her pocket. As they neared, the two groups faced off across an invisible divide, Little Eden's defenders on one side, the white mob on the other. The air crackled with unspoken threats, each side sizing up the other like dogs circling a bone. A man stepped forward from the white crowd, his face ruddy and slick with sweat. Lila recognized him, Jed Harper, a mechanic who'd once spat at her when she dared to buy thread from his wife's store. where's the boy? Jed bellowed, his voice thick with whiskey. Hand him over, and maybe we won't have to come get him ourselves. A murmur rippled through Lila's group. A tall man named Marcus Tate, a barber with hands steady enough to shave a king, stepped up, his shotgun resting easy on his shoulder. Ain't nobody handin' over Elijah. He ain't done nothin' but shine shoes. You got proof otherwise? Jed sneered, his lip curling. Proof? I got a white girl sayin' he laid hands on her. That's proof enough for me. Lies. A woman shouted from behind Lila, her voice sharp as a blade. It was Sarah Brooks, Elijah's mother, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. My boy wouldn't hurt a fly, and you know it. The mob jeered, their laughter a jagged edge. Someone threw a bottle, and it shattered at Marcus's feet, glass skittering across the dirt. Lila flinched, her grip tightening on the shears. Thomas shifted beside her, his rifle half-raised, then came the sound of tires crunching gravel. Clara Mayfield's motorcar screeched to a stop between the groups, kicking up a cloud of dust. She leapt out, notebook in hand, her hat askew but her chin high. What's this, then? She called, her voice cutting through the din. A lynching party before supper. Jed's face darkened. Stay out of this, Mayfield. This ain't your story. It's everybody's story when a boy's life hangs on rumors, Clara shot back. She scribbled something in her notebook, her pencil flying. I'm puttin' this in the Herald. Names and all. Who's first? The mob hesitated, a ripple of unease passing through them. Clara's words carried weight, her articles had shamed men into hiding before. But Jed wasn't one to back down. He spat at her feet, the glob landing inches from her polished shoes. You think your paper's gonna stop us? We're talking that boy. And anyone who stands in our way's gonna regret it. Before Clara could reply, a shot rang out. It was impossible to tell who fired first, someone from Little Eden, or a trigger-happy fool in the mob. The sound split the night, and chaos erupted. Men shouted, weapons clashed, and the air filled with the acrid bite of gunpowder. Lila ducked as a bullet whizzed past, her heart hammering. Thomas yanked her behind a lamppost, his rifle barking as he fired into the fray, "Get down!" He yelled, his voice raw. She obeyed, crouching low as the world turned to madness. Through the haze, she saw Marcus take a bat to the shoulder, staggering but swinging back. Sarah Brooks screamed, clawing at a man who'd grabbed her arm. Clara was on her knees, shielding her head as bottles rained down. And then, fire. Someone tossed a torch, and it landed in the dry grass near the courthouse steps. Flames licked upward, hungry and fast. Lila's mind raced. They couldn't hold here, not against this. We gotta get back. She shouted to Thomas, tugging his sleeve. They'll follow us to Little Eden. He nodded, grim-faced, and fired one last shot before pulling her up. The group from Little Eden began to retreat, dragging their wounded as the mob pressed forward, emboldened by the fire and the blood. Clara stumbled after them, her notebook clutched to her chest, her face streaked with dirt, by the time they reached the edge of their neighborhood. The night was alive with screams and smoke. Lila turned, her breath catching as she saw the glow on the horizon, not just the courthouse now, but something bigger. The mob wasn't stopping. They were coming for everything. Thomas grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. They're gonna burn it all, Lila. We can't fight that. She shook him off, her eyes blazing. Then we die tryin'. This is our home. But even as she spoke, the first flames flickered in the distance, dancing toward Little Eden like a devil set loose. And in that moment, Lila knew, whatever happened tonight, nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 3, The Night of Ashes, Dunston, Oklahoma, May 1923, the air turned thick with smoke as Lila Jackson stumbled back into Little Eden, her lungs burning with every breath. The glow she'd seen from the courthouse had grown into a wall of flame, racing toward them on the heels of the mob. Shouts and gunfire echoed behind her, a cacophony of rage that drowned out the crickets and the wind. Thomas Reed kept pace at her side, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his limp forgotten in the adrenaline of flight. Clara Mayfield trailed a few steps back, her notebook clutched like a lifeline, her face pale but set. They reached the heart of Little Eden, the barbershop, the theater, the neat rows of clapboard houses, and found chaos already taking root. Men and women spilled into the streets, some armed, some dragging children or hastily packed bags. The word had spread fast, the mob wasn't content with Elijah Brooks. They wanted blood, land, everything Little Eden had built from nothing. Lila's eyes darted to her dress shop, its sign swaying in the rising wind. She started toward it, but Thomas grabbed her arm. "Ain't no time, Lila. They're comin'." She yanked free, her voice breaking. "That's my life in there. I ain't leavin' it to burn." Before he could argue, a roar split the night, horses, dozens of them, thundering down the street. Men rode bareback or clung to wagons, their faces twisted with hate, torches blazing in their hands. Behind them, a tide of foot soldiers surged, armed with rifles, axes, anything that could break or burn. Lila froze, the sight searing into her mind. This wasn't a mob anymore. It was an army. The first torch flew, arcing through the air and crashing through the barbershop's window. Glass shattered, and flames leapt up, greedy and fast. Screams erupted as people scattered, some firing back at the riders, others running for cover. Marcus Tate stood his ground, his shotgun booming as he took down a man on horseback. But another rider swung a club, and Marcus crumpled, blood pooling beneath him. "Marcus!" Lila cried, starting toward him, but Thomas hauled her back, his grip iron. "He's gone. We gotta move," he shouted. Dragging her toward an alley, Clara stumbled after them, coughing as the smoke thickened. "They're everywhere," she gasped, pointing to the west, where more flames bloomed. The theater was ablaze now, its marquee collapsing in a shower of sparks. The hotel followed, its electric lights flickering out as fire swallowed the walls. Lila's heart pounded, her mind a blur of fear and fury. She saw Sarah Brooks in the distance, clutching a crying child, Elijah's little sister, before disappearing into the haze. She saw old Mr. Carver, the grocer, swinging a broom at a man twice his size, only to fall under a hail of fists. Everywhere, Little Eden was dying, its pulse snuffed out by flame and lead. They ducked into the alley behind Lila's shop, the heat pressing in as the fire spread. Thomas kicked open a shed door, shoving Lila and Clara inside. "Stay low," he hissed, peering out through a crack in the wood. "They're torching everything." Lila sank to the dirt floor, her hands trembling. Through the wall, she heard the crackle of flames eating at her shop, her fabrics, her sewing machine, her dreams. A sob clawed its way up her throat, but she choked it down. There'd be time for tears later, if she lived. Clara scribbled furiously in her notebook, her pencil shaking. "I'll write it all," she muttered, more to herself than them. "The world's gonna know what they did here." "World don't care," Thomas snapped, his voice bitter. "They'll read it, shake their heads, and forget by supper. Then I'll make 'em remember," Clara shot back, her eyes fierce despite the soot streaking her face. A crash outside silenced them. Footsteps pounded closer, and voices rose, harsh, gleeful. "Burn it all. Ain't nothin' worth savin' here," someone yelled. Lila peeked through a knothole and saw three men, their silhouettes distorted by the firelight. One hefted a can of kerosene, splashing it against the shed's wall. Her breath caught. "They're gonna trap us," she whispered, scrambling to her feet. "We gotta get out." Thomas nodded, shouldering his rifle. "Back wall's thin. I'll bust it open. Run when I say." He rammed his shoulder into the wood, once, twice, until it splintered. The heat was unbearable now, the air shimmering as flames licked closer. Clara grabbed Lila's hand, squeezing tight. "We'll make it," she said, though her voice wavered. The wall gave way, and Thomas shoved them through, the jagged edges tearing at Lila's dress. They spilled into the night, the world a hellscape of smoke and ruin. Little Eden was unrecognizable, houses reduced to skeletons, the street littered with shattered glass and bodies. Lila's knees buckled, but Clara pulled her up, her grip fierce. "Keep movin'." Thomas barked, leading them toward the edge of town. Gunshots rang out behind them, and a bullet grazed his arm, drawing a grunt but no pause. He fired back blindly, the recoil jolting his frame. They reached the railroad tracks, the line between Little Eden and the white side of Dunston, just as the mob's shouts grew louder. Lila turned, her chest heaving, and saw the full scope of the destruction. Flames devoured everything she'd known, a red-orange tide that left only ash in its wake. The theater, the hotel, her shop, all gone. And with them, the lives of people she'd loved. "We can't stop," Clara said, her voice hoarse. "They'll kill us if we do." Lila nodded, numb, and let them pull her across the tracks. The white side of Dunston loomed ahead. Its houses dark and silent, as if the town had turned its back on the carnage. She wondered how many watched from their windows, smug or indifferent, while Little Eden burned. As they slipped into the shadows, a single thought anchored her: this wasn't the end. She'd lost everything tonight, her home, her people, her hope, but she'd find a way to fight back. Even if it took years, even if it killed her, she'd make them pay. Behind her, the fire roared on, a beast fed by hate, its hunger boundless. Chapter 4, The Weight of Silence, Dunston, Oklahoma, May 1923. The night stretched on, endless and heavy, as Lila Jackson, Thomas Reed, and Clara Mayfield stumbled through the outskirts of Dunston. The glow of Little Eden's destruction painted the sky behind them, a cruel dawn that refused to fade. They'd crossed the railroad tracks into the white side of town, where the streets were eerily still, no shouts, no hoofbeats, just the distant crackle of fire and the occasional wail carried on the wind. The silence here was worse than the chaos they'd fled. It was the silence of complicity, of curtains drawn tight and doors bolted shut. Thomas led them to a dilapidated barn on the edge of a fallow field. Its roof sagging and its walls weathered gray. He'd used it once to store tools for a farmer who'd since moved on, and it was the only place he could think of where no one would look. The door creaked as he shoved it open, ushering Lila and Clara inside before barring it with a rusted pitchfork. The air smelled of mold and old hay, a damp reprieve from the smoke that clung to their clothes. Lila sank onto a pile of straw, her legs giving out as the adrenaline drained away. Her hands shook, smudged with soot and blood, not hers, she realized with a jolt, but someone's. Marcus's, maybe, or Sarah's. She couldn't tell anymore. Her dress was torn, her shawl lost somewhere in the chaos. And the shears in her pocket pressed cold against her thigh, a useless weight now. Thomas slumped against the wall, his rifle propped beside him. Blood seeped from the graze on his arm, staining his sleeve dark, but he didn't seem to notice. His face was a mask, eyes hollow, as if the war he'd survived had found him again in a different form. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, her notebook open on her lap, though her pencil lay still for once. Her hat was gone, her auburn hair tangled and streaked with ash, but her jaw was set, her mind clearly racing. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were their ragged breathing and the faint rustle of mice in the rafters. Lila stared at the barn's warped planks. Her mind replaying the night in jagged flashes, the torch soaring through the barbershop window, Marcus falling, her shop consumed by flames. She wanted to scream, to claw at something, but her body felt leaden, anchored by a grief too vast to name. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "We can't stay here long," she said, her voice low but steady. "They'll come looking once they're done celebrating." "Celebrating," Lila echoed, the word bitter on her tongue. "They burned our homes, killed our people, and they're celebrating it." Thomas shifted, his voice rough. Ain't nothing new. Seen it overseas, men cheering over corpses like it's a damn picnic. Same hate, different skin. Clara's eyes flicked to him. Sharp with curiosity, but she didn't press. Instead, she flipped open her notebook, scanning the pages she'd filled in the chaos. I got names, she said. Jed Harper, Bill Tatum, half a dozen others. Descriptions of what they did. I'll write it up, every detail. The Herald won't run it, but I'll find a paper that will. Chicago, maybe, or New York. Lila's head snapped up, anger flaring through her numbness. You think words are gonna fix this? They're dead, Clara, Marcus, Sarah, God knows who else. My shop's gone, my life's gone, and you're sittin' there writin' like it's a story for some white folks to cluck over. Clara flinched, but she didn't look away. It's not about fixing it, Lila. It's about making sure they don't forget. If I don't write it, who will? They'll say it never happened, or we deserved it. You want that? Lila opened her mouth to snap back, but the fight drained out of her. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Clara was right, words wouldn't bring back Little Eden, but silence would bury it deeper. Still, the thought of strangers reading about her pain, shaking their heads before turning the page, made her stomach churn. Thomas cleared his throat, breaking the tension. She's got a point, Lila. But Clara, you write that, you're paintin' a target on your back. They already hate you for pokin' around. This'll make it worse. I know, Clara said, her voice softening. But I can't sit on my hands while they get away with murder. Can you? He didn't answer, just stared at the blood on his sleeve, his jaw tight. Lila watched him, wondering what kept him here, guilt, loyalty, or something he couldn't name. She didn't trust him fully, not yet, but he'd risked his life for her tonight. That meant something. The barn door rattled, and they all froze. Thomas grabbed his rifle, motioning for them to stay down. Through the cracks, they saw a figure, a boy, no more than 12, his face streaked with tears and soot. Lila recognized him instantly, Jimmy Brooks, Elijah's cousin, Jimmy. She whispered, crawling to the door. Thomas lowered the rifle as she unbarred it, pulling the boy inside. He collapsed against her, sobbing, his thin frame trembling. They got Elijah, he choked out. Took him from the jail, before we even got there. Strung him up. Burned him. Aunt Sarah's gone too, shot trying to stop M. Lila's breath caught, a fresh wave of grief crashing over her. She held Jimmy tight, rocking him as his words sank in. Elijah, the boy who'd grinned at her over a pair of polished shoes, was dead. Sarah, fierce and proud, gone too. The mob had taken everything. Clara's pencil scratched again, faster now, her face pale but resolute. Thomas cursed under his breath, slamming a fist against the wall. Bastards, he muttered. Goddamn bastards. We gotta get him out of here, Lila said, her voice hoarse but firm. Jimmy can't stay in Dunston. None of us can. Where? Thomas asked, his tone flat. Ain't no place safe for you now. North, Clara said, closing her notebook. Tulsa's got people who'll help, black folks who've been through this. I've got contacts there. We can hide, regroup. Lila nodded, though the thought of leaving Dunston, of abandoning the ashes of Little Eden, felt like tearing out her own heart. But Jimmy's sobs, muffled against her chest, steeled her resolve. She'd lost too much already. She wouldn't lose him too, all right, she said, meeting their eyes. Tulsa. But this ain't the end. They'll pay for this, I swear it. Outside, the fire's glow dimmed, swallowed by the night. But inside the barn, a spark of defiance flickered, fragile but alive. Chapter 5, The Road to Tulsa, Dunston, Oklahoma to Tulsa, May 1923, the barn's shadows clung to them as Lila Jackson, Thomas Reed, Clara Mayfield, and young Jimmy Brooks slipped out into the pre-dawn chill. The sky was a muddy gray, streaked with the last embers of Little Eden's ruin, and the air carried the faint sting of ash. They moved quickly, silently, skirting the edge of Dunstan's white district ere lamplights flickered behind drawn curtains. No one spoke, the weight of the night pressed too hard for words. Clara's motorcar waited where she'd hidden it, a battered Ford Model T tucked behind a copse of scrub oaks half a mile from the barn. The engine sputtered to life with a reluctant groan. And they piled in, Thomas at the wheel, his injured arms stiff but functional, Lila beside him, Jimmy curled in her lap, and Clara in the back, her notebook clutched tight. The boy's sobs had quieted to a soft whimper, his small hands gripping Lila's torn dress like she was his last anchor. "Keep to the back roads," Clara said, her voice low. "Main streets'll be watched. They'll want to finish what they started." Thomas nodded, steering the car onto a rutted dirt path that wound north through fields and thickets. The headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating gnarled trees and the occasional glint of a rabbit's eyes. Every jolt of the uneven ground rattled Lila's bones, but she held Jimmy close. Her jaw set. She wouldn't let him see her break, not yet. The first hour passed in tense silence, broken only by the engine's cough and the crunch of gravel. Then, headlights flared behind them, twin beams slicing through the dark. Thomas cursed, gripping the wheel tighter. "Company," he muttered, glancing in the cracked side mirror. Lila twisted to look, her heart lurching. A truck rumbled into view, its bed packed with men, silhouettes against the dawn, rifles bristling like thorns. She recognized the shape of Jed Harper's hat, the same man who'd spat at Clara and led the charge on Little Eden. They'd found them, faster. Clara urged, leaning forward. "Lose em in the woods up ahead." Thomas floored the gas, the car lurching as it hit a ditch and bounced back. The truck gained, its horn blaring, a mocking howl that echoed through the trees. A shot cracked and the rear window shattered, glass spraying over Clara. She ducked, swearing, but kept her head low, scribbling in her notebook even as the car swerved. "They're gonna kill us." Jimmy cried, burying his face in Lila's chest. "No, they ain't," Lila said, her voice fierce despite the fear clawing at her. She grabbed Thomas's rifle from the floorboard, awkward in her hands but steady enough. "Slow down a tick. You crazy?" Thomas snapped, but he eased off the gas just enough. Lila leaned out the window, the wind whipping her hair. And fired. The recoil jolted her shoulder, the shot wild but loud. The truck swerved, a shout rising from its bed. She fired again, and this time a tire blew, sending the truck skidding into a ditch with a sickening crunch. "Nice shot," Thomas grunted, pushing the car back to speed. The headlights faded behind them, swallowed by the woods, but Lila didn't relax. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. The road stretched on, a ribbon of dirt and danger. Dawn broke fully, painting the sky a cold pink, and with it came the first signs of life, a farmer's cart, a distant train whistle. Tulsa was 40 miles north, a city Clara swore had refuge, black communities that had weathered their own storms. People who'd take them in. But every mile felt like a gamble, every shadow a threat. Jimmy stirred, his voice small. "They killed Elijah, 'cause of me, didn't they? I shoulda gone with him that day." Lila's throat tightened. "No, baby. Ain't your fault. They killed him 'cause they're hateful, not 'cause of anything you did." "He's right, though," Thomas said, his tone flat. "They wanted a reason. Didn't matter who or why." Clara glared at him from the back. "Don't put that on the boy. They'd have found an excuse no matter what, Elijah, Lila, any of us. It's bigger than one person. Then what's the point?" Thomas shot back, his knuckles white on the wheel. "We run, they chase. We fight, they win. Same damn story every time. The point," Lila cut in, her voice steel, "is we're still breathin'. They took everything, but they didn't take that. And long as I got breath, I got fight. Thomas fell silent, his jaw working, but he didn't argue. Clara reached forward, squeezing Lila's shoulder, a rare gesture from a woman who kept her distance. "We'll make it to Tulsa," she said. "And then we'll figure out how to hit back." The car rattled on, crossing a rickety bridge over a muddy creek. Mid-morning brought heat, the sun baking the cracked leather seats, and with it came exhaustion. Jimmy dozed against Lila, his face streaked with dried tears. She stroked his hair. Her mind drifting to the faces she'd never see again, Marcus, Sarah, the children who'd played outside her shop. Each loss carved a hollow in her chest, but it fueled her too. She'd meant what she said, this wasn't over, a shout jerked her awake. Ahead, a barricade loomed, logs and barrels stacked across the road, manned by 3 men in dusty coats. Rifles glinted in their hands, and a Confederate flag fluttered from a pole. Thomas slowed, his face grim. "Checkpoint. Probably looking for stragglers." "We can't turn back," Clara said, her voice tight. "They'll catch us." "Then we go through," Lila said, hefting the rifle again. "Ain't got no choice." Thomas nodded, revving the engine. "Hold on." The car surged forward, tires spinning as the men shouted and raised their guns. Shots rang out, pinging off the hood. Lila fired back, her aim shaky but enough to scatter them. The Ford crashed through the barricade, wood splintering, and barreled past, leaving the men cursing in the dust. Miles later, the skyline of Tulsa shimmered into view, smokestacks and church spires rising from the plains. Lila exhaled, a shaky breath of relief, but it was tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. Tulsa wasn't the end, it was a beginning. A place to heal, to plan, to turn grief into something sharp and unrelenting. As the car rolled into the city, Jimmy stirred, blinking up at her. "We safe now?" he asked. "For now," Lila said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "But we got work to do." Chapter 6, The Haven of Strangers, Tulsa, Oklahoma, May 1923. The Ford Model T coughed to a stop on a dusty street in Tulsa's Greenwood District, its engine wheezing like an old man after a long climb. Lila Jackson eased Jimmy off her lap, her arms stiff from holding him through the harrowing drive. Thomas Reed killed the ignition, his wounded arm trembling as he flexed it, while Clara Mayfield climbed out, brushing glass from her skirt and scanning the unfamiliar surroundings with sharp eyes. The sun hung high, beating down on a neighborhood that pulsed with life, children chasing a ball, men in suspenders hauling crates, women calling out from porches. It was a mirror of Little Eden. Or what Little Eden had been, and the sight twisted a knife in Lila's chest. They'd made it to Tulsa, 40 miles and a lifetime from Dunstan's ashes, but safety felt fragile, a threadbare blanket against a storm. Clara had promised refuge here, connections forged through her reporting on the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, a wound this city still bore, its scars hidden beneath the bustle. She led them now, her steps brisk despite the exhaustion etching her face, toward a 2-story brick building with a sign reading Greenwood Sentinel. The newspaper office hummed with the clack of typewriters and the murmur of voices, a stark contrast to the silence they'd fled. Inside, a woman looked up from a desk piled with papers, middle-aged. Her hair pulled into a tight bun, her dark eyes keen behind wire-rimmed glasses. Clara strode forward, extending a hand. "Mrs. Ellis?" "Clara Mayfield, Dunstan Herald. We spoke last year about your work here." The woman, Mrs. Ellis, rose, her gaze flicking over the ragtag group, Lila with Jimmy clinging to her side, Thomas with his bloodied sleeve, Clara herself smeared with soot. Recognition softened her stern features. "I remember you, Miss Mayfield. You wrote about our rebuilding. What's brought you here looking like the devil's own?" Clara didn't mince words. "Dunstan burned last night. Same as you had here 2 years back. Mob torched our Negro district, Little Eden. We're all that's left. Far as we know." Mrs. Ellis's face tightened, a shadow of old pain crossing it. She nodded, as if she'd heard the story too many times. Come in, then. You're safe here, for now. Bring the boy too. She ushered them into a back room, where a cot and a table sat amid stacks of newsprint. Jimmy sank onto the cot, his eyes dull, while Lila hovered near him, her hands restless. Thomas leaned against the wall, silent but watchful, his rifle still close. Mrs. Ellis fetched a basin of water and rags, setting them down with a quiet efficiency that spoke of experience. Wash up, she said. I'll get word to some folks who can help. You need food, clothes, a place to lay low. We've got ways here, learned Em the hard way. Lila dipped a rag in the water, wiping Jimmy's tear-streaked face. Thank you, she murmured, her voice rough. Didn't know where else to go. Mrs. Ellis studied her, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You're strong, girl. I can see it. We lost plenty in 21, homes, businesses, lives, but we're still standing. You will too. The words were a lifeline, thin but real, and Lila clung to them as she cleaned the grime from Jimmy's hands. Clara sat at the table, her notebook open, recounting the night to Mrs. Ellis in clipped, precise sentences: Jed Harper's torch, Marcus's fall, the flames that swallowed Little Eden. Mrs. Ellis listened, her expression grim, then took the notes with a promise to print them in the Sentinel. We'll spread it, she said. Folks here'll want to know, some will even march for it. But don't expect the white papers to care much. They buried ours quick enough. Clara nodded, undeterred. I've got contacts up north, Chicago Defender, maybe the Crisis. They'll run it. I'll make sure of it. Thomas snorted, breaking his silence. Words again. Lot of good they did us back there. Mrs. Ellis turned to him, her gaze piercing. Words kept us alive, mister. After 21, papers like ours got money flowing in, food, clothes, lumber to rebuild. You're here, 'cause of words, whether you like it or not. He looked away, chastened but unconvinced, and Lila felt a pang of sympathy. Thomas was a man adrift. Caught between worlds, his cynicism a shield against a hurt she couldn't fully grasp. She wondered how long he'd stay, how long any of them could hold together. By afternoon, help arrived. A wiry man named Reverend Holt, his collar frayed but his voice warm, brought a basket of cornbread and stew, along with a bundle of clothes. A woman called Miss Ida offered to take Jimmy to her boarding house, where he'd be safe with other children who'd lost kin. Lila hesitated, her grip tightening on the boy's shoulder, but his weary nod told her he needed rest she couldn't give him yet. She let him go, promising to visit soon, her throat tight as he shuffled away. Reverend Holt stayed, sitting with them as they ate. Heard what happened, he said, his tone gentle but firm. You're not alone in this. Greenwood's got scars, but we've got strength too. What you planning next? Lila set down her spoon, her appetite gone. Ain't had time to plan. Just tryin' to breathe. Fair enough, he said. But when you're ready, we've got folks here, lawyers, organizers. They're fightin' for what we lost in 21. Could use your fire. Fire, Lila echoed, a bitter laugh escaping her. Fire's what took everything I had. And it's what'll forge something new, Holt replied, unflinching. You're here, ain't you? That's a start. The words lingered as dusk fell, the room growing dim. Thomas stepped outside to smoke. His silhouette a lone figure against the fading light. Clara pored over her notes, plotting her next move, while Lila sat alone, staring at her hands. They were empty now, no shop, no home, no family, but Holt was right. She was here. And that meant something. Outside, Greenwood buzzed on, a heartbeat of resilience she could almost feel. It wasn't Little Eden, but it was something, a haven of strangers who knew her pain. For the first time since the flames, Lila felt a flicker of possibility, faint but stubborn, like a coal refusing to die. Chapter 8, The Line in the Sand, Tulsa, Oklahoma, June 1923. The back room of Mount Zion Baptist Church smelled of coffee and sweat, a cramped space packed with folding chairs and restless bodies. Lila Jackson sat near the window, the summer heat pressing through the glass, her hands clasped tight to keep them from shaking. Thomas Reed leaned against the wall, his cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling, while Clara Mayfield stood at a makeshift table, scribbling notes as Mr. Grayson, the lawyer, outlined their options. Reverend Holt presided, his presence a steady anchor amid the storm of voices. It had been 2 weeks since the Greenwood Sentinel ran Clara's story, and the echoes were still rippling. The Chicago Defender had picked it up, printing a scathing editorial that called Dunstan's massacre a stain on America's soul. Donations trickled in, nickels and dimes from black families across the Midwest, along with letters demanding justice. But with the attention came danger. Word from Dunstan was grim. Jed Harper and his ilk were rallying, vowing to silence the troublemakers in Tulsa before the story spread further. Grayson adjusted his spectacles, his voice measured but firm. "We've got a case, weak, but it's there. Negligence by Dunstan's sheriff, maybe conspiracy if we can prove the mob was organized. Problem is evidence. Most of it burned, and witnesses." He glanced at Lila and Thomas. "Well, you're here, not there. So we go back," Lila said, her tone sharp. "Find what's left, folks who saw it, anything." Thomas snorted, flicking ash onto the floor. "Go back. They'll string us up 'fore we hit the tracks. Ain't nobody in Dunstan talkin' to us now." "He's right," Holt interjected, his brow furrowed. "Risk's too high. We work with what we got, your testimony, Clara's notes. Build from that." Clara nodded, her pencil pausing. "I've got names, descriptions, enough to start. I'm wiring it to the NAACP in New York tomorrow. They'll push it federally if we can't win local." "Federally?" Thomas scoffed. "You think Washington gives a damn? They let Tulsa burn in 21, didn't lift a finger." "They might now," Grayson countered. Public's riled up. Papers are callin' it a pattern, Dunstan, Tulsa, Rosewood. Pressure's buildin'. Lila listened, her mind racing. Lawsuits, telegrams, newspapers, it was all so slow, so distant from the fire she still felt in her bones. She stood, her chair scraping loud against the floor. "This is good, real good, but it ain't enough. They're comin' for us, Reverend. Jed Harper ain't sittin' around waitin' for a judge. We gotta hit back, now." The room stilled, eyes turning to her. Holt's expression tightened, a mix of caution and curiosity. "What you mean, Lila?" "I mean fightin'," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her gut. "They burned us out, killed our people. Words are fine, but they don't bleed. We need guns, plans, something to make 'em think twice." Thomas straightened, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Now you're talkin'. I'm in, been itchin' to put a bullet in Harper since that night." Clara's head snapped up, alarm flashing in her eyes. "You're talking war, Lila. That's not justice, that's revenge. We'll lose everything we've built here." "Maybe," Lila shot back, "but sittin' here waitin' for 'em to burn Greenwood too ain't justice either. You saw what they did. You think they'll stop?" Grayson cleared his throat, uneasy. "Violence'll tank the case. Courts won't touch us if we're shootin'. Public'll turn too, call us the savages they already think we are." Holt raised a hand, silencing the brewing argument. "Hold up. Lila's got a point, they ain't playin' fair, and we can't pretend they will. But Clara's right too, blood'll drown us if we ain't careful. We need both, law to tie their hands, force to guard our necks." The compromise hung heavy, a tightrope no one wanted to walk. Lila sat back down, her mind churning. She didn't want war, not really, but the thought of Jed Harper laughing over Elijah's grave made her hands itch for a trigger. Before anyone could respond, the door burst open. Miss Ida stumbled in, her face ashen, Jimmy trailing behind her with wide, frightened eyes. "Riders," she gasped. Scouts saw half a dozen, armed, coming up the south road. "Look like Dunstan men." The room erupted. Holt barked orders, men to the windows, women to fetch rifles stashed from 21. Thomas grabbed his gun, his limp forgotten as he moved with soldier's instinct. Clara stuffed her notes into her bag, her face pale but resolute. Lila pulled Jimmy close, her heart hammering. "How far?" Holt demanded. 10 minutes, maybe," Ida said, breathless. "They're bold, ridin' in daylight." "They're testin' us," Thomas growled. "Seein' if we'll run again." "We won't," Lila said, her voice steel. She looked at Holt. "What's the plan?" He met her gaze. His decision made. "We hold the line. Grayson, get to the phone, call the sheriff, for what it's worth. Clara, you and Ida take the kids to the basement. Rest of us, outside." Clara hesitated, then nodded, ushering Jimmy and Ida toward the stairs. Lila grabbed a rifle from a man named Pete, its weight familiar now, and followed Holt and Thomas into the street. Greenwood buzzed with alarm, shopkeepers barring doors, mothers calling children inside. A dozen men joined them, armed with shotguns and grim resolve, forming a ragged line across the road. Dust rose in the distance, the rumble of hooves growing louder. 6 riders emerged, their faces shadowed under hats, rifles slung across their backs. Jed Harper rode at the front, his ruddy face split by a sneer. He reined up 50 yards out, his voice carrying over the tense air. "Where's the scribbler?" he bellowed. "Heard she's been flap-pin her gums. Time to shut her up." Lila's grip tightened on the rifle, her pulse roaring. Holt stepped forward, calm but unyielding. "You're on our ground, Harper. Turn back, or you won't like what happens." Jed laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Your ground? Ain't nothin' yours 'cept what we let you keep. Hand over Mayfield, and maybe we won't torch this dump too." Thomas raised his rifle, his voice low. "Say that again, bastard." The riders shifted, hands drifting to weapons. Lila's breath caught. This was it. The line in the sand. She aimed at Jed, her fingers steady on the trigger, waiting for Holt's word. "Last chance," Holt said, his tone ice. "Ride out, or stay permanent." Jed's grin faded, his eyes narrowing as he weighed the odds. The silence stretched, taut as a wire, until he spat into the dirt and jerked his horse around. "This ain't over," he snarled, leading his men back into the haze. Lila exhaled, her arms trembling as the tension broke. Holt clapped her shoulder, a rare approval in his nod. "You held," he said. "That's a start." But as the dust settled, she knew Jed was right, this wasn't over. The line was drawn, and the fight was coming, whether they chose it or not. Lila Jackson's hands trembled as she struck the match, the tiny flame flaring against the dark. She crouched beside Thomas Reed in the brush outside Dunstan, their 5-man team, Greenwood survivors with grit in their eyes, spread out around her. The plan was sharp and desperate: burn Jed Harper's supply sheds, cripple his mob's march on Tulsa, and slip away. Thomas nodded, his war-honed instinct steady, and they moved. The sheds, stacked with kerosene and grain, went up fast, flames roaring into the night sky. Shouts erupted from the town, but Lila and her crew were shadows again before the first bullet flew, racing back to Greenwood with firelight at their heels. Dawn broke over Tulsa. Tense and gray. The raid had bought time, but not peace. Reverend Holt met them at the church steps, his face lined with worry and pride. "You slowed wagons are stalled, supplies gone. But they're comin' anyway, angrier now." Lila's chest heaved, her voice rough. Let M. We'll be ready. Clara Mayfield stepped out, her eyes blazing despite the exhaustion. You've made this a war, Lila. My wires got through, Chicago's sending help, lawyers maybe, but it won't be here today. This is on us now. Thomas grinned, wiping soot from his face. Good. I'd rather shoot than wait. Greenwood buzzed with grim resolve. Men stacked sandbags, women hid children, and rifles glinted in every doorway. Holt's map marked the South Road, Harper's path, and 30 armed souls stood ready, a thin line against a storm. Dust rose in the distance, dozens of riders and wagons, torches flickering like a devil's promise. Jed Harper rode at the front, his ruddy face twisted with hate, a rope coiled at his saddle. Holt shouted orders, voice steady. Hold the line. No shootin' lest they cross it. The mob halted 50 yards out, Harper's bellow cutting the air. You burned my town, you bastards. Hand over the girl and the scribbler, or we'll take it all. Lila stepped forward, rifle raised, her heart a drumbeat. You burned mine first, Harper. This ends here. He laughed, harsh and cold. Ends when you're ash, like your boy Elijah. The name lit a fuse in her. She fired, the shot grazing his shoulder, and chaos broke loose. Bullets flew, men fell, Greenwood's defenders and Harper's mob locked in a brutal dance. Thomas took down 2 riders, his aim deadly despite his limp. Clara, defying orders, darted out with a pistol, her reporter's calm shattered by fury. Holt staggered, a bullet in his thigh, but kept shouting, rallying them. Lila zeroed in on Harper, weaving through the fray. He swung his rifle at her, but she ducked, slamming her own into his gut. He stumbled, cursing, and she tackled him from his horse, fists flying. Blood slicked her knuckles, hers, his. It didn't matter. She saw Elijah's grin, her shop in flames, and drove her knee into his chest, pinning him. You're done, she hissed, pressing the barrel to his temple. His sneer faltered, fear flickering in his eyes. You won't. You're weak, like all of ya. A gunshot rang, not hers. Thomas stood over them, his rifle smoking. Harper's second-in-command sprawled dead. Finish it, Lila, he said, voice flat. Or I will. She hesitated, Clara's words echoing, justice, not revenge. But the weight of Little Eden's ashes crushed her doubt. She pulled the trigger. Harper's head snapped back, blood pooling in the dirt, and the mob faltered, their leader gone. Shouts turned to panic. And they broke, fleeing into the dusk. Greenwood stood, battered but unbroken. 8 defenders lay dead, a dozen wounded, including Holt, who leaned on a pew inside the church, his face gray. Clara bandaged him, her hands shaking, her notebook lost in the fight. Thomas slumped against a wall, staring at nothing, while Lila knelt by Jimmy, who'd crept up from the basement, his eyes wide but dry. We won, he whispered. Yeah, she said, her voice hollow. We did. But victory tasted like ash. The South Road was strewn with bodies, Harper's men, Greenwood's kin, and the silence was heavy. Clara's story had spread, and help arrived days later, lawyers from the NAACP, funds from Chicago. Reporters sniffing for blood. Grayson filed a suit against Dunstan's sheriff, but the courts dragged, and no one expected much. The defender called it a stand against tyranny, white papers spun it as Negro vengeance. Greenwood rebuilt, brick by brick, but the scars ran deep. Weeks later, Lila sat on the church porch, a letter from St. Louis in her lap, a march planned in Elijah's name. Thomas joined her, his limp worse now, a bottle in hand. Worth it? He asked, voice rough. She stared at the horizon, where Dunstan's smoke had long faded. Had to be. They won't forget us now. Clara approached, her typewriter back in use, a new article in hand. It's not over, she said. More towns. More mobs, they're watching. We've got to keep pushing, law, words, whatever works. Lila nodded, the fire in her tempered but alive. We will. For Elijah. For all of M. Tulsa, Oklahoma, July 1963. Lila, now gray and stooped, stood before a crowd in Greenwood, her voice steady despite the years. A marker gleamed behind her, etched with names: Elijah Brooks, Marcus Tate, the fallen of Little Eden in 23. Thomas's son, a quiet man with his father's eyes, stood beside her. Clara's granddaughter, a journalist, scribbled nearby. The Civil Rights March stretched down the street, signs demanding equality, echoes of their fight 40 years past. We stood then, Lila said, her words carrying over the murmurs. We stand now. Ain't never been easy, but it's ours, this ground, this fight. Applause rose, a tide of defiance. She touched the marker, feeling the names under her fingers, and thought of fire, not just the kind that destroys, but the kind that forges. America's wounds still bled, segregation, violence, hate, but Greenwood endured, a testament to those who'd burned and risen. Washington, D.C., March 2025, a young woman, Aisha Reed, stood in a museum, her eyes on a faded photo: Lila, Thomas, Clara, rifles in hand, Greenwood's ruins behind them. A plaque told their story: Dunstan's fall, Tulsa's stand, a footnote in a nation still wrestling with its past. Aisha, Thomas's great-granddaughter, traced the names, her thesis on racial justice half-written in her bag. Protests raged outside, voices demanding change, and she smiled faintly. The fight wasn't done, but it had roots, deep, stubborn, unbroken. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope Black Fire Chronicles has given you a deeper and more powerful perspective on history. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story. See you in the next video, where history's fire keeps burning. Black Fire Chronicles, where the fire never dies.